This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
In a slight relief to the common man, the centre has announced steps that will reduce fuel prices across the country. Central excise duty on fuel has been slashed. That means petrol prices will dip by 9.5 rupees per litre and diesel by 7 rupees per litre.
This news should cheer us up, right? But wait before you celebrate. Because the ground reality is quite different, especially when it comes to diesel, once called the poor man's fuel. If you are buying diesel from a private company's petrol pump, chances are either you will be paying a higher than normal price, or you may be staring at a dry or closed pump that doesn't have the diesel for you. Then the option you will be left with is getting the fuel from a pump operated by a state-owned oil company. Now that's the issue diesel vehicle owners and truckers are facing today. The reason? Private oil companies are restricting the supply of fuel to their dealers, resulting in end consumers like you and me either paying more for our diesel or driving a few extra miles to get it cheaper. And of course, the rise in transportation costs mean a rise in the cost of daily items. So while the government's move of excise duty cuts on fuel is welcome, why are we still staring at a price crisis? What is the whole tussle between the fuel dealers and the oil marketing companies? Let's find out. It's Thursday, the 26th of May. From the Economic Times, I'm Kiran Somvanshi. You are listening to Fuel Feuds on the Morning Brief. In this episode, I speak to my colleague Kalpana Pathak, Senior Assistant Editor at the Economic Times, who first broke the story on country's oil companies cutting diesel supply. And I also speak to Probal Sen, Senior Research Analyst, Oil and Gas Sector, Institutional Equities, ICICI Securities. Together, we decipher this problem of rationing of diesel, losses to the pump operators, and what companies can do. There are over 70,000 petrol pumps in India. 80% of these are operated by dealers that enter into a long-term lease agreement with oil marketing companies. And sometimes these agreements can stretch up to 30 years. The oil marketing companies can be either state-owned like Indian Oil Corporation, IOCL, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, BPCL, or Hindustan Petroleum Corporation, HPCL. Or they can be private sector players like Rosneft-owned Nayara Energy, that was formerly Essar Oil, Reliance Industries, or Shell. The fuel dealers have been suffering losses since the past 3 months, a situation further aggravated by the cut in the excise duty. So what's causing these losses?
In March, dealers of private fuel retailers, which include Reliance Industries, Nayara Energy, and Shell, began complaining that the companies are cutting fuel supplies to their retail outlets, especially diesel. The dealers were told that the problem is only temporary and may get resolved by the first or second week of April. But the petrol pumps continued to run dry, and 3 months on, the diesel shortage still persists. Now, why are companies cutting diesel supply? There are multiple reasons to this. One, the oil marketing companies, public, which include Indian Oil Corporation, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, and Hindustan Petroleum Corporation, and private, are incurring losses on sale of each liter of petrol and diesel, as pump prices have not been revised in tandem with the increase in crude oil prices, as well as the international product prices. Now, there is always a difference between retail and bulk fuel prices, with bulk prices, which are for fleet and industry, being more than retail prices. So according to oil marketing companies, consumers are also flocking to retail outlets, tanking up fuel at retail prices, which is cheaper. This is further multiplying losses for them. The second reason is that due to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Many European nations are shunning oil imports from Russia. This void left by Russia has created an opportunity for Indian companies to fill via exports. So, Indian oil companies, largely private, have been exporting diesel to the European nations.
That's a tricky scenario, caused by an unforeseen event like a war and worsened by the revival in diesel demand. But before we delve into the nitty gritty of the problem, let's understand from Probal the basic economics of the diesel business in India. Diesel cracks or spreads and gross refining margins are the two main parameters on which the health of the oil and gas industry depends.
Typically, what a refinery essentially does is take a barrel of crude, distillate it at different temperatures, and you get different petroleum products: petrol, diesel, LPG, jet kero, which is essentially your aviation turbine fuel, fuel oil, petcoke, and so on. So, when we talk about a gross refining margin, what we are simply talking about is that all of these products obviously sell at different prices in the market. So a diesel would sell maybe at a $15 premium to crude. A fuel oil would sell maybe at even just a $1 to $2 premium to crude. And they would all come out in a specific proportion. So one barrel of crude will produce maybe about 40% of diesel. So zero point 0.4 barrels of diesel, zero point 0.2 barrels of, let's say, petrol, zero point 0.2 barrels of LPG. So these fractions multiplied by their prices will give you a weighted average selling price. So that weighted average selling price minus the cost of crude is essentially what gives you your refining margin. So that's a very simple way to look at what we mean when we say refining margin. And product cracks are even simpler. Your product price minus the price of crude essentially is your product crack. So if your diesel that is selling for, let's say, $110 a barrel, and at that time the crude cost is, let's say, $100 or $95 a barrel, the diesel crack simply would be 105 minus 90 or $15 a barrel.
The reason we are talking about these technical terms is that these cracks and margins are ruling at a very strong level right now for the industry. Probal shares the numbers.
So GRMs have been actually on a tear for some time now. If you look at Singapore GRMs, they have been hitting new records pretty much every week over the last 6 to 7 weeks. If we look at Singapore benchmark GRMs, for example, from a level of somewhere around $6 to $7, which they were in January and February of this year, they have gone to something like $17 to $18 in the month of April. And in the month of May, they are actually at about $20. This is, I'm talking benchmark margins. And obviously, extremely strong diesel spreads have been a major component of that. Diesel spreads, which were basically averaging about $15 in January and February, hit a high of around $26 in March, about $36 in April. And in early May, they actually crossed $40 for probably the first time ever, at least in the last 7-8 years that I've been following the spread. So the product cracks are obviously extremely strong, and that's the reason why, as I said, that given that price increases have not been allowed, the gross marketing loss that is there implied in diesel. Over the first quarter, if I look at till date, it is averaging close to about 15 rupees of loss on a gross level that is there in the system. So on the one hand, obviously in refining, you are seeing quite a bit of strength. And I think the Q4 results of both IOCL as well as HPCL reflected that. Both of them probably reported some of their best quarterly GRMs in the last 4 to 5 years. But at the same time, what really hurts them even more is the marketing losses.
So, how is it that while on one hand, the oil companies are sitting on record high refining margins, but on the other hand, they are posting losses when marketing their products?
So in India, obviously that peculiarity is there because while the pricing is theoretically deregulated, the government, after all, is the promoter. And of course, it will have some say in terms of how much the OMCs can actually pass on in a high price environment, what we are going through now. In terms of performance, refining and marketing tend to be different proportion of EBITDA for the three different companies. HPCL, for example, has the highest dependence on fuel retail rather than just refining of its earnings. Typically, For a rough idea, that would be probably 55 to 60% dependence is on marketing and around 40% is on refining. BPCL would probably be in the 55-45% range. IOCL is perhaps more balanced with its better and larger refining capacity. And therefore, that would be more evenly balanced between the proportion of earnings that it gets from refining as well as from marketing. So, in the current environment, therefore, what is happening is that the refining strength is helping offset the marketing losses to a certain extent. But still, just as a thumb rule, every dollar per barrel of incremental GRM can actually help compensate for maybe about 55 to 60 paisa of retail fuel losses. So if you put that into context, the kind of losses that are being incurred today would need about $15 of incremental GRM or $15+ of GRM to sort of keep things on an even keel. So that's the situation that thankfully was there in Q4. Hence, earnings did not take too much of a hit for the OMCs. We'll see BPCL results that are yet to come, but at least in IOCL and HPCL, that was the case. But for FY23 as a whole, it does look very difficult to imagine a full year where somebody can deliver $20 GRMs, which is what you would need if you have to keep making a 10 rupee loss on retail fuels.
So, for oil companies, it is essentially a balancing act between the refining business and marketing at the pumps. Well, with oil companies having their own set of challenges to cope with, dealer management may not be a priority right now. So, here are the issues the dealers are facing.
They are facing shortage of fuel. Dealers don't really have much of an option right now. They are availing of the fuel supplies, whatever the companies are making available. And because of that, 3 to 4 days in a week, their retail outlets are running dry. And this is impacting their income as well as clientele. Now, after COVID, they were expecting sales to get better. And then the multiple waves of COVID came and their sales were again impacted. So before the sales gets better, the Ukraine and Russia issue happened. So that is one segment where the income as well as client are actually moving away from them. And the second is with certain markets being deprived of diesel, public sector oil marketing companies are forced to meet the additional demand thus created. So this is putting pressure on the public oil companies as well, in addition to impacting those particular markets. For instance, last month in Gujarat, in certain pockets, there was no fuel available at the private fuel retailers. So the oil companies were asked to meet demand there. So they had to actually cut short on few liters of petrol, few thousand kiloliters of petrol in other areas. This is what the state association dealer head told me when I spoke to him last month. So these are the two key issues where both companies and the dealers are battling. And last week, even the Petroleum Dealers Association from Andhra wrote to BPCL, which is actually the coordinator for oil marketing companies when it comes to retail, asking them that their officials are actually sending them WhatsApp messages asking to supply less diesel. So there is a sort of artificial shortage created of diesel right now, even when we are a refining surplus country.
Well, I also spoke to a fuel retailer who wishes to remain anonymous.
There is a direct impact on our income. एक तो सप्लाई के हिसाब से इरेगुलर कंसिस्टेंसी के हिसाब से लॉसेस से, दूसरा जो क्रेडिट से रिकवरी नहीं हो पा रही हमारी, एक तो वो लॉसेस है। दूसरा कि हम अपना ओवरहेड एक्सपेंस मिटिगेट नहीं कर पा रहे हैं, क्योंकि आज हम हमेशा स्टाफ को नहीं बोल सकते। जैसे कंपनी हमको बोलती है कि भाई आज हम आपको प्रोडक्ट देंगे, 2 दिन के बाद नहीं देंगे, तो हम स्टाफ को ऐसा नहीं बोल सकते कि आप 2 दिन आओ, 3 दिन छुट्टी पे रहो, क्योंकि ओवरहेड एक्सपेंस तो डे टू डे रेगुलर हमारे वही के वही है। पर डे के हिसाब से आप गिनती कर लो मैडम, तो ऑलमोस्ट 17,000 से लेके 23,000 तक का लॉस अभी बेयर कर रहे हैं हम लोग। 3 महीने से लॉसेस माउंटिंग हो रहा है। पहले क्या था कि कमीशन कम था, साथ में इन्वेस्टमेंट भी कम था, तो उस हिसाब से 70-80 रुपए तक जो प्रोडक्ट का प्राइस चल रहा था तब तक बेरेबल था। लेकिन जब 90-100 रुपए के आजू बाजू चला गया ये अपना पेट्रोल डीजल का रेट, तो कमीशन भी नेचुरल है कि वो कम होता है और कमीशन भी इन्होंने रिवाइज नहीं किया है। तो ये लॉसेस का कैलकुलेशन बैठता है कि भाई ज़्यादा लॉस हो रहा है, तब से लॉस ज़्यादा हो रहा है। सिंस लास्ट 3 मंथ्स लॉसेस ज़्यादा हो रहे हैं और जब लॉसेस करने की बारी आती है तो उसमें कंपनी को डीलर की भागीदारी चाहिए और जब प्रॉफिट की बारी आती है तो कंपनी को खुद का प्रॉफिट अकेले का ही चाहिए, उसमें डीलर का पार्टिसिपेशन नहीं चाहती है कंपनी। तो कंपनी भी अपना फायदा देख रही है, कंपनी भी डीलर का कुछ नहीं सोच रही है और गवर्नमेंट अपने हिसाब से चल रही है।
The dealers are meeting the company managements to present their demands. They are demanding a commission of 5% on the sale of fuel. Why? The dealer commissions have not been revised since 2017 and are currently hovering at around 2.5 rupees a litre on diesel. Even as the price of diesel has spiked and the overall cost of operations have gone up almost by 35% since the last revision. And there are other demands too. The consortium of dealers have requested state-owned OMCs to not curtail retail fuel supply in order to minimize their losses. The association is afraid the situation may lead to fuel shortage at retail outlets and cause law and order problems. Nayara's dealers, for instance, are demanding that dealers should be allowed to close the business and delease the retail outlet. Let's understand from Kalpana the response that she got from the companies to the issues faced by the dealers.
It actually began with Reliance Industries. They communicated to the dealers that they'll be cutting down fuel supplies by 50%. Now, this was supposed to be taken on the selling average of October, November, December of last year, because these were the 3 normal months that the country witnessed before the third wave kicked in and after the second wave. So these 3 months we witnessed normal demand, so to say. So these companies would be taking, even Nayara has communicated the same to their dealers, that October, November, December, they'll be taking the average sales of the dealers, and of that 50% will be provided to them. And if these dealers want more than the 50% quota, then they will have to buy that at a higher price from these companies. Reliance has not specified that yet, but Nayara has. And then they can probably sell it. If they do not sell that extra 50% of the quota that they've been provided, Nayara has said that they will compensate the dealers to the tune of 1 rupee 75 paise per litre. This is what the dealers have told us. So that is how these private companies are dealing. Shell apparently has not cut fuel supplies to its retailers, though it is said to be retailing fuel at a premium of 5 to 6 rupees, depending on which market it is. Oil companies, on the other hand, the state oil companies, have denied that they have cut fuel supplies. In fact, BPCL mentioned to us in a mail that diesel supply for them, for the OMCs, have actually gone up for the past couple of months, especially from March, when private fuel retailers are facing this problem.
So state-owned OMCs are talking about diesel sales actually going up. And on the other side, you have companies like Reliance and Nayara rationing the diesel. Why such a different stance from both sides?
Because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, many European nations are shunning oil imports from Russia. So that is a market available for Indian companies. And the cracks are healthy. So the private companies are free to export, not that state companies are not, but they have a so-called social obligation to meet the domestic demand first. So they are obligated to do that. So they're not exporting any diesel or petrol as of now. Though they do export lubricants and fuel oil and naphtha, which has been happening for years. But diesel probably is a lucrative product for private companies to export, and they are maximizing on the current opportunity that has opened for them.
So, what will be the impact of this issue in the near term? Probal and Kalpana share their views.
In some ways, I think the OMCs are correct that the overall consumption has gone up. The data by PPAC that consumption continues to grow. HSD on a YOY level HSD is actually up around 8%, even in the month of April, despite whatever has happened with respect to. And overall consumption of fuels is up 12% on a YY level versus April 2021 numbers. If that number is holding even for May, that will suggest that there is quite a lot of momentum that is there for at least at this point of time. But if prices are not allowed to be actually corrected, then frankly, I don't see any way out for the private dealers to sort of continue to supply diesel. I mean, at a 14 rupees loss, why would you sort of sell diesel at retail? You would much rather sell it in some of the export markets. So one fear, of course, is that this is something that we have seen before. There was Reliance had shut down pretty much, I think, 1,600 retail pumps at one go when deregulation sort of again was stalled in the earlier instance when prices had shot up in the international market and domestic prices were not keeping pace. So it's not as if there is no precedent for that happening. One would hope that that's not the case right now. But other than that, I think price increases have to start to get allowed. Otherwise, there's no real solution to this.
I just hope that this issue is resolved amicably between the dealers and the company. Like Prabal mentioned, that it had happened in 2008 for RAL retailers, and we were actually spoke to them for our stories this time round. They all feared a replay of 2008 because dealers have their livelihoods, their investments resting on this. A lot of them are, most of them actually, are in a lease agreement with these companies for 30 to 40 years. They have all invested money, lakhs and lakhs of it, in setting up the infrastructure. So, in addition to that, they also provide employment to many at their outlets. So there will be job losses if there's no proper solution to this problem. And especially in this kind of a high inflation scenario post-COVID. So a lot of factors involved here. And that's probably one of the reasons why dealers have decided to come together and fight it out this time as against it was last time when it happened. So we just hope that the companies, in addition to looking at their profitability, are also mindful of the fact that the dealers need an existence to go forward.
It seems to be a tight situation for the dealers. They are stuck with long-term agreements with the oil companies that they can't exit out of without paying heavy penalties. Also, they can't afford to let their pumps go dry and lose their clientele. And of course, they can't continue incurring losses while operating their pumps only a few days a week. Oil companies may want to consider revising their dealer commissions and also increase their daily fuel supplies to them if they are committed to maintaining a healthy partnership with their dealers. The crisis also highlights the role of the government in balancing the interest of all the stakeholders: the state-owned oil marketing companies, the private sector oil companies, the fuel dealers, and the end consumers. Let's hope this is a temporary problem and the common man doesn't end up facing the brunt of the two parties not coming to terms. You have been listening to Fuel Feuds on the Morning Brief with me, Kiran Somvanshi. Thanks Kalpana and Probal for joining in with your insights. This episode was produced by Surbhi Modi from The Economic Times and Saundarya Jayachandran from Awaaz. Sound editors Swati Joshi from Awaaz and Indranil Bhattacharjee from The Economic Times. Executive producer Arijit Burman. We hope you like this episode. Do share it on your social media networks. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits mentioned in the description.